Hello and welcome back to the Nightorf. In this chapter we're going to look at some sidelines, and this time we're looking at fourth move Qxd4 and fifth move f3. So these are the variations that are in between the anti-Sicilians and the Nightorf. White's last or final attempts to jump out of the main variations of the Nightorf. So let's see how do we get there. E4 c5, knight f3 d6. d4, it seems as though white goes for the open Sicilian. There are of course a lot of alternatives here on the third move. We'll get to them in the next chapters. Here we're looking at d4, c takes d4, and now in this chapter we're going to be looking at queen takes d4, which is a well-respected sideline that's been around for a long time, and knight d4, knight f6, and here f3. It's the final moment to get out of the Nightorf, as knight c3, a6 would get us to our favorite opening. I'll start with queen takes d4. Here I personally played both knight c6 and also knight f6 first. There are some very subtle points with starting with knight f6, but the amount of transpositions there is even larger, and in order not to confuse you, I've decided to recommend knight c6, and I also worked it out quite well. So I believe knight c6 is just as fine and a little bit simpler in terms of move orders. Here essentially white has a choice between bishop b5, which was the old way of playing this. This is how they always played, and the less common but equally interesting, the move queen e3, which is particularly popular lately, but mostly due to the fact that in most of the Nightorf variations and even in the anti-Sicilians, black has found reliable ways, and so white started looking for less explored ground, and this is one of the last places that hasn't been that this well explored yet. But we are going to explore it right now. So queen e3. Here we can play g6 or knight f6 first. It doesn't really matter. I've started with g6, but again knight f6 is absolutely fine as well, as equally good. Excuse me. Here white has essentially two different setups. He can play with the bishop on e2 and with the bishop on c4. The second one is the idea of Levon Aronian, and also quite a sensible setup. White right now can choose different move orders. You can start with h3, also stopping bishop g4 very early. Also start with knight c3, I believe. But essentially, at the end of the day, after we play bishop g7 and knight f6, white has to place the bishop either on e2 or on c4. So basically there are two different lines, and the rest is just a move order business. So I decided, for simplicity's sake, to look at just two options here, not to mention all the needless transpositions. So let's look at first bishop e2 setup and then at bishop c4. In bishop e2 we play bishop g7. Again, knight f6 of course will transpose. Bishop h6 doesn't win the piece because of queen c3 when white attacks the h8 rook. So bishop g7 castle, knight f6. h3, again, sooner or later white plays h3. He needs this move, stopping bishop g4. So we will be happy to get rid of this bishop. Castle, and here white has a choice. He can either play c4 or knight c3, and he can also play the flexible move rook d1, which is the main line. If knight c3, we have the option of knight b4. It's a pretty clever regroup. We're hitting the c2 pawn first, and after queen d2, we play b6, developing the bishop to b7. This is one of the ways to develop the c8 bishop, and the one we will see also in some other lines. And now the point is that after a3, I propose knight a6, which is a very cool regroup. The knight is heading towards c5, from where it will put the pressure on the e4 pawn. A very strong sequence, knight b4, knight a6, and here black is very comfortable. After knight c4, I propose very strong move, queen b6. Here white shouldn't take. After queen b6, a b6, knight c3 will reroute the knight to c5, and white will have issues with e4 pawn. C3 knight will be hanging and issues also with c4 pawn. Let me just show that here a little bit more vividly. Yeah, white is not able to consolidate this position, so white should play knight c3 first. We go knight d7. You can also take first and play knight d7. In the end game, these Marusti binds positions are not so dangerous for black, because as you know, when you have less space, then trades are always to your advantage, and in particular queen trade is quite relieving. The end game should be around equal, but I prefer knight d7. Once again, tempting white to take on b6, after which we can take also with the pawn again and play knight c5. And now if white plays the very inventive move queen f4, trying to avoid the trade, then we have plenty of different options. White is not very harmoniously placed here with the queen on f4, bishop on c1. Usually in the Marusti bind structures he has much better development, but here we have many different ways of playing. I like this idea, bishop takes c3, bc f6. Sort of a typical idea in different variations. We give up this dark squared bishop, but ruin white's pawn structure tremendously, and yeah, c3 and c4 pawns are really very weak, and knight c5 is coming, and white doesn't have good coordination, and the knight is in the way of the f pawn, and so white cannot really start the kingside initiative here, and we're not really missing the g7 bishop here as much. Knight rook d1 is the most critical. White is trying to stay flexible. Here I recommend bishop e6, and yeah, now white goes knight c3. This happened with one move or the other in my game against Magnus Carlsen. I think in that game I started with knight f6 before knight c6, and Magnus played h3, but eventually we landed in this position. In here I played a very sophisticated move, queen c8. I also wanted to get rid of the pin just in case and try to be very smart, but simpler is just rook c8. There's no need. Yeah, and here e5, it's not dangerous at all because of knight e8 when the d6 pawn is protected, and opening of the position is good for black with the white queen here in the way on e3. And if white plays 11 bishop d2, we have knight d7 regrouping the knight, and yeah, we have standard play here along the c file, and this bishop is very strong, and at some point knight comes to e5 and c4 and so on. This is pretty good. a3 is been played trying to stop knight b4. Now we go a6. We intend b5 at some point. Rook b1 has been played. Now white wants to prepare for knight d5 push, have this pawn protected just in case. Here we go knight queen c7. The queen gets developed a little bit, puts more pressure on the c file. The knight can join the game via knight a5 to c4, and after knight d5, which is the only critical continuation we take with the bishop ed and knight a5, and we have lots of play here. The d5 pawn is quite weak. The queen on e3 is in the way. That's constantly, of course, the issue in this line. White had not an entirely sound development, slightly disharmonious. In general, I believe that this whole system with queen e3 is not something I would recommend to lesser experienced players. I believe someone like Magnus Carlsen or Levon Aronian, they know the rules well enough to afford to break them, but if you are a lesser experienced player and want to learn healthy chess, then I believe white should generally try to stay away from these positions, because it is very hard to play such a less harmonious position, and it's very easy to get worse with white. And already here after c3 b5, black is very comfortable. We have simple play queen b7, putting pressure on the d5 pawn. Knight comes to c4, and white has to invent something and find a way to protect the d5 pawn and somehow develop his pieces. It was very comfortable for black. The bishop e2 setup. Levon tried bishop c4. His idea was to later perhaps bring the queen to e2, a little more harmonious. We still play bishop g7, castle, still play knight f6. h3, again white has to make this move sooner or later. If he plays knight c3, castle, rook d1 and omits it for too long, we go bishop g4. We are always happy to get rid of this bishop. The knight e5 is coming. If need be, this other knight is coming as well to e5. So h3 is critical. Now we castle, knight c3. Rook d1 is the same thing, I believe. After b6, white has to play knight c3. If he starts with e5 here, we have once again knight e8 and knight c3, bishop b7. We will see this position from the other move order. Knight c3, yes, and here b6, here's the move I recommend. With bishop on e2, we had this bishop e6, rook c8 setup. Now bishop e6, although still possible, is a little less tempting. But I like this b6 idea here, pretty much develop the bishop to b7 and free the c8 square for the rook. And yeah, essentially I will play something like bishop b7, rook c8, knight a5, then knight comes to c4, and the usual knight d7 if needed, of course, the usual dragon play. Rook d1 is the main continuation, bishop b7, and now principled junction here. White can either go for the e5 push or play slowly with queen e2. e5 is double-edged. After knight e8 we protect the d6 pawn well. White can play e6. Now we go f5, a typical response, very strong. We keep the bishop open, and we don't want to take on c3, just show that the bishop is open. And the pawn on e6 is both a strength and a weakness. Of course, it is pretty far advanced. At the same time, it's potentially quite weak, so these things are always double-edged. I believe black is very fine here. Okay, knight g5 is tempting, sending the knight to f7, although there is no clear follow-up there. I recommend knight a5, kicking the c4 bishop away, and after bishop d5, white tries to neutralize the b7 bishop. Otherwise, f4, f3 would also be a consideration. Bishop d5, now knight c7. Knight is very well placed here on c7. It applies some pressure on the e6 pawn and forces the bishop to take a decision. After bishop b7, knight b7, we intend to bring this knight to c5, bring the queen to c8 perhaps, or also possible to e8. And e6 pawn, yes, it starts to look increasingly more weak, and you know, the position is just very, very complex and double-edged, and I believe white is risking as much as black does here. If white doesn't take up the challenge with e5 and plays queen e2, then we can play knight d7, and we have developed our pieces quite well. I like that we have found the place for this bishop on b7. We next want to bring the rook to c8 and play knight a5 and exert pressure along the c file. For example, a4, it's a typical move. Try to gain some space on the queen side. We go rook c8, rook a3. It's an interesting rook lift, not because it's so great, but because it's not easy for white to otherwise develop his pieces. Rook a3 also guards the knight a little bit on c3. Now we play knight a5, bishop draws back to a2. Here we don't have to double the pawns. I recommend simple queen c7, intending knight c4, and after bishop e3, now knight c4, we have to watch out for knight b5, so we play a6 first, and next we want to play knight c4 and have very good typical Sicilian play here. Again, well, here, unlike the line bishop e2, white has managed to position himself quite harmoniously, but still it is quite hard to play this way, and white can easily get also outplayed. So I'm not really a fan of this system, especially for players that are not as experienced as Levon or Magnus Carlsen. I think that sums up queen e3. We looked at bishop e2 and bishop c4 setups. Now let's look at fifth move bishop b5. That's the old way of playing it. Excuse me. Here I recommend bishop d7. By the way, there were also some other systems. I think a6, bishop c6, bc was also a thing, if I remember well, but bishop d7 works quite fine. Now here there is again the a choice. There is the traditional way, how they used to play, you know, when I was still studying theory as a kid. Back in those days they would take, with the bishop, and then they would develop the knight to c3, bishop to g5 and castle long. It looked quite impressive. And that's what we will look at first, but also more modern approach is to play queen d3 and then going for the Smarovsky bind with c4. Very trendy business, and at some point it was very, very trendy when white had just discovered these possibilities against the Najdorf and the Sicilians. But I think I've managed to successfully deal with those as well. First, let's look at bishop takes c6. Bishop takes c6. Now here, if white plays c4, it's a worse version of queen d3 variations. We can also just play knight f6, g6, and then develop and then later choose if we push a6 or not. The queen anyway has to draw back to d3, but here also there is a nuance f5 extra option, and I find it a very beautiful one. After ef, the point is to go queen a5 check and recapture the f5 pawn, and after knight to queen f5, our bishop is very strong here. We have successfully gotten rid of the e4 pawn, and the bind is weakened, and next we want to play e5 and develop our pieces. For example, castle e5, queen e3, and now bishop e7. We are inversing the move order, as knight d4 is something we are not so happy to allow. But after bishop e7, rook e1, now that rook is committed to e1, we can play knight f6, knight d4, and queen h5. Knight e6 bc, we lost a strong bishop, but now our pawn structure is improved dramatically. Our central control is very good, and I believe yeah, black has quite some potential here. White can play for the endgame with queen f3, but in the endgame as well, after takes, knight d7, our pawns are a little soft, but there is definitely potential to control these central squares. And once we manage to regroup well, bring the king to f7, a rook to b8, push this a pawn forward a little bit, I believe black has potential in this endgame, and with such good central control, I think nothing should go wrong here. But usually if white starts with bishop takes c6, he intends to go knight c3. Now we play knight f6. We might want to play g6, so white goes bishop g5. Now we play e6, long castle, and bishop to e7. Here white has a few options. I'll look at two. Usually white's trying to regroup with queen e3, knight d4, and then push his kingside pawn with f4, and so on and so forth. But it is not as dangerous and energetic as it seems. Black has plenty of counterplay. For example, after queen d3, very strong idea is queen a5. We keep the bishop on g5 in check. We don't allow knight to come to d4 just yet, and potentially also we have ideas of queen a6 offering a queen trade, as we'll see. Now I looked at a variety of options. Bishop d2 is one. Now we have a very direct response in d5. If e d5, we have knight takes d5. Position opens up and simplifies, and after e5 we have knight g4, very strong, hitting the f2 pawn, intending queen b6, and if queen d4, hitting the knight and defending the f2 pawn. It looks great for white, but we have a very strong queen b4, protecting the knight indirectly and offering a queen trade, after which we are obviously happy with our bishop pair. So bishop d2 is made by d5. Instead, white has a few other options. If king b1, we play castle. h4 is a normal logical move. White wants to defend the bishop and play knight d4 next. Here we hit him with h6. White can choose to ignore it with g4, but we don't have to take just yet. It's quite dangerous, of course, to open the h file. We can just play a useful move with the rook. Rook fd8 is one of those. And now after bishop d2, intending to push with g5, we have this typical strong idea, queen a6. And that is really something to remember, the crucial idea in this line. And the endgames, of course, are tremendous for black here. These pushes are then slightly weakening. If white plays bishop d2 directly, then once again we have this move queen a6, and yeah, the endgames are always fine. We have the bishop pair, and the fact that we have the double pawns is not a big deal, is well compensated by this a good central control and the fact that we have this unopposed light squared bishop. I also look at 11 bishop h4. It is going to transpose to 10 rook h1 likely after castle, knight d4. Again, white is trying with bishop h4 to get out of the attack on g5. We play castle, knight d4, and now rook f8. Nice idea, just in case, protecting the e7 bishop, setting up sometimes knight takes e4 tricks. And after rook h1, we play rook ac8, and as we'll see later, this transposes to the to another line. After f4, there will be knight takes e4 tactic. Now finally, we should look at 11th h4. White once again wants to protect the bishop and play knight d4. Here we play h6, asking a question, what does white do? If he takes on f6, we take on f6, not knight d4. Yeah, we have just a very strong bishop. I like queen b6 as really the easiest if we get an endgame with queen takes d4 and takes twice, we'll be very comfortable with the king on e7 and a good bishop. And if white takes on c6, we take with the b pawn. After queen d6, rook b8. White has quite some issues with the b2 pawn, and if he plays queen a3 protecting it, then we can take on f2. So just a very good position for black. Bishop f6 is not very good. After bishop d2, once again we have this move queen a6, a good rule to remember. Bishop d2 is met by queen a6, and the endgame is roughly equal again. Here I give takes, rook h1, rook c8, and again the fact that the pawns are somewhat weak and doubled is well compensated by the bishop pair. Let's for 10 queen d3. 10 rook h1 is also played as the main move. Now we castle, and here white once again has a choice. Queen d2 is played a lot, but it's not a very good move. White will have some issues with the e4 pawn after h6. Here, yeah, the tempting sacrifice doesn't work. After bishop h6, gh, queen h6, we have knight h7, very strong, typical move, always protecting the g5 square. And besides threatening bishop g5 check, we also want just to play bishop f6, king h8, rook g8. Also, there's just absolutely no attack after knight h7. Black is winning here. Bishop h4, very importantly, is losing to knight takes e4. That's why this move is very unfortunate. And 12 bishop f4 is met by e5 when again white has no choice but to go to g3, and the bishop on g3 is cut out of play by these two pawns. It's stranded there, and after knight d7 you want to follow up with b5 and rook c8, play on the queen side when white's bishop is totally locked out of play, and there is no counterplay as these pawns are behind white's pieces. Queen d2 is just a very unfortunate move. E5 is very direct, and there are a lot of games with some kind of old theory, but it's just not very good. DE5, now here most games go queen h4, that's the point. White should in fact play it much more safe, take on e5, when black can still play queen c7, but just trading is fine. Queen d4, rook fc8 leads to equality. White takes on c4, rook takes c6, on c6, rook takes c6, knight e4, and here we have a strong sequence. We play e5, kicking the rook, and after rook d1. Now if white tries to play bishop f6, then we play e takes d4, bishop e7, and now rook e6, very strong. We not only attack the bishop but also create a pin, and white is losing material here. And after rook d1 we have knight takes e4, bishop takes e7, knight takes f2, attacking the rook, and after rook d2, strong intermezzo with rook e6, hitting the bishop and protecting the pawn. And here white can win back the pawn with bishop d6, but position is completely equal, I believe. For example, e4, rook f2, rook d6, rook e4 is a likely scenario with a complete equality. But the main point of e5, d5 is queen h4, but that leads to a line that just doesn't work. We play queen c7, knight takes e5, idea is knight g4. It looks a little tricky, but it just isn't very dangerous. We play rook fd8. Also h6 is possible, but rook fd8 is very simple. After knight g4 we take on d1, rook takes d1, and take on g4 here. And after bishop e7 have a very strong regroup, knight to h6. The knight suddenly rejoins the game via f5, and bishop d6 can be met by strong intermezzo, knight f5. And as the queens get traded, our knight is suddenly very good on h4, g3 is met by knight f3, and it is black who is better. There's fantastic pieces here, nothing to worry about. Of course, it probably took people quite a while to find knight takes g4, knight h6, but with the modern computers it's all pointed out immediately. So e5, also not a great attempt. Finally, queen d3 is an option, once again threatening knight d4, queen a5, a familiar idea already. Bishop h4, best attempt. White tries to bring the knight to d4, and here we play rook ac8. The rook belongs on this open file. Knight d4, and now rook f8. Again defending the bishop, intending potentially knight takes e4 ideas. Of course not yet, as the after rook e4 the bishop will be protected, but after king b1, a6, another slow move, preparing b5. Now if white goes f4, then we can strike with knight takes e4, and the tactics work for us. After a capture on e4, h4 is hanging. After capture on e7, c3 is hanging, and the best for white is knight takes a6, rook c6, rook e4. And after bishop takes h4, white still has some compensation thanks to the strong move f5, opening the fourth rank for the rook and putting some pressure on the e6 pawn. But this is only enough to maintain equality. Not even that. I believe black is slightly better here after bishop f6, knight d5, another beautiful move, but we can just defend the bishop here with queen d8. Of course, the pawn is pinned. After queen d8, f6, rook e6. White does have a beautiful square on d5, but it comes at the cost of a pawn, and we've got a beautiful outpost on e5 for a bishop. So black is doing quite well here. Finally, we should look at the move king b1, the most often played move. There are 1,000 games here in the database, yeah, which is really a lot. This is a relatively popular sideline amongst club players and amateurs. So we should. It's good that we are taking the time to study it. Also, I remember as a kid, I found it always very dangerous and annoying. Of course, I didn't know all these queen a5, queen a6 subtleties, and if you don't know them, it could get quite dangerous, of course. But we do. So here we play h6. Taking on f6 is, of course, a disaster. After bishop f6, the bishop is a monster on f6. So white goes bishop h4. Now we play b5, strong move. And this explains why white should have probably played 11 queen d3, because this b5 gives black a very easy play. And now after bishop takes f6, which is what the expert of this line, Sergei Zhigalko, played, white can temporarily win a pawn after bishop f6, queen d6, but as so often in this case, these bishops more than compensate. We play queen b6, and now white has knight e5, trying to get back one of the two bishops. But after bishop e5, queen e5, we'll be able to regain the pawn, and after b4, knight e2, queen f2, the position is very comfortable for black, and it's only black who's better here. If knight d4, we simply have to move bishop b7. These pawns, of course, are quite weak, and mostly the king on g8 is pretty safe. That's the most important. I believe it's quite bad. This happened, by the way, in a game between Zhigalko and Harsha, an Indian player, played in an online internet 2020. Online internet is a nice one. Yeah, sometimes the things I say, Jesus. 6 queen d3. That's the trendy line, the most challenging as well. White doesn't rush with taking. He in fact waits for us to push him with a6, and he wants to build a Marosi bind with c4. It's quite a dangerous setup, so we should know what we're doing. g6 again, knight f6, or g6 just a move order trickery. Though g6 is a little bit perhaps more accurate, because now we have to deal with bishop g5 as well. So yeah, g6 anyway is what I recommend. c4, if white doesn't go for the Marosi setup, we get bishop on g7, knight on f6, castle, and have a good dragon setup here. So c4 is most critical. Now we go bishop g7, knight c3, knight f6, and now castle. With one move order on or the other, we reach this position. There were no real meaningful alternatives so far. And here white plays h3. Again, almost universally, he really needs to stop this knight g4 move, which would allow us a lot of counterplay with knight e5, so h3. And here, unfortunately, we do have to play a6. White hasn't taken on c6 yet, so we have to force him. We go a6. If white doesn't take bishop a4, we play knight b4. There are also other options. Bishop a4 is not a very challenging move, but knight b4 is pretty good. It's a very concrete solution. We for now attack the queen. After queen e1, we take on a4, knight a4, and now we can immediately blast the position open and get rid of this bind with b5, cb, ab, and after knight c3 we can play queen b6, and white is not able to capture on b5 after, let's say, a3, knight c6, knight d5, because of knight takes e4 when we are regaining the pawn. So once we got rid of this bind with b5 and the c4 pawn is gone, of course black has nothing to complain about and has very good play on the queen side. 11 bishop c6 is the main line, bishop takes c6, and now knight to d4. White has stopped direct b5. He has pointed all his pieces towards that, so b5 is not coming just yet. And here the main line is knight d7, a sensible way of playing, knight to c5. But in terms of trying to solve the opening problems by force and get rid of our space issues and the bind, I recommend a very strong move, Queen b6. Now this could lead, of course, if white knows his theory, it could lead to a very equal endgame. So if you want to keep more play in the position, feel free to play a knight d7. Of course, bishop e3, knight c5. White plays usually queen c2, I believe. Black can then play knight e6 sometimes. And you can certainly play this, but of course you can even play this without trying to solve your problems immediately. But of course that comes with a risk. In all these positions against the bind, there is a danger that we'll never get opportunity to push neither b5 nor f5, and then black position is a little bit cramped. But if you feel confident and if you are stronger than your opponent and believe that your opponent will make a mistake, then of course there is no need to try and force the matters with 12 move queen b6, which I would recommend. So again, try to be practical and smart about it. But in case you do play a challenging opponent and need to solve your opening problems, then queen b6 does that quite well. The idea is that we try to hinder white's development. Bishop e3 is now met with queen takes b2, and there is some pressure now on the d4 knight, as after bishop e4 knight, d4 knight, d4, d4 knight is going to be hanging. So here white has two options, either rook d1 or challenge our bluff with bishop e3. But it's not a bluff. We take the pawn on b2. Queen can run away via a3. So white plays knight d5, controlling the a3 square. Now after bishop d5 ed, we can no longer return, because after queen b6 there's going to be a discovery on the queen. But here we use we use I wouldn't say tactics, but a very concrete resource, knight d7. Now after rook fb1, the queen is trapped, but we have knight c5, counter punch hitting the d3 queen, and after rook b2 knight d3 we get an equal endgame. After rook b7 rook fc8. Yeah, I believe the position is equal, but if anything, black is very comfortable. The c4 pawn is currently hanging, and the material is equal. Then as for bishop e3, we just grab the pawn. After 13 rook d1, which is more cautious, we play knight d7. We will be quite happy to trade everything on d4. As you know, the endgames in these Marzi structures are fine. The lesser pieces, the better, usually for black, and the endgame is always a relief. So white has two options. He can once again go for the challenging bishop e3, or he can try to play queen e3, which is very awkward as the queen is in the way of the bishop. It is not very harmonious, but as bishop e3 leads to some simplifications by force, queen e3 is white's last attempt at trying to get a complex game and trying to fight for some sort of some sort of advantage, you could say, but not really. White is not very harmonious here, and we have various ways of finding counterplay. I recommend rook f8. Now there are two ideas. Knight f8 to e6 is one, and also direct e6 d5 is pretty good. After b3, we can play knight f8, knight e6, and yeah, once again, depends a little bit on what your goal is in this game. If you want to solve the opening problems in the most direct way, then so I like to say, if you're preparing for the World Championship match, then e6 d5 definitely the way to go. But knight f8, knight e6 just as good. Gives black excellent counterplay in a complicated position. But e6 is very direct, bishop e2 d5, and white has nothing better than to go for simplifications with cd ed. Now the e file is open, so white e pawn is pinned. So he has to go knight c6. Now we can take on e3, fe, bc, and at the end of the line e3 is weak. After ed, cd, rook d5, rook e3, position simplifies. I continued a little bit because there's an important nuance in the rook endgame after rook d7, bishop c3, bishop c3, rook c3. There is a nuance, rook f1, we go rook f8, and after rook f6 we can give up this pawn with rook c2, because as we know in rook endgames it's all about activity. After rook takes a6, we have now rook e8, and we are the ones grabbing the second rank first. And yeah, here the endgame is very fine for black as rook e2 is incoming. So a little deep, of course, but again, this is only if you want to equalize and take this stuff very seriously. Same story after 14 bishop e3. Here we go for queen b2. That's the whole point. Otherwise, there's no point playing queen b6. Queen b2, it works. Now rook a1 is white's point. Queen a3, knight c6 bc, and now white is a pawn down, but he has this strong resource, knight d5, winning back the pawn with the intermezzo, and that's why this line is working out fine for him. We take on d3, knight e7, king h8, and rook d3. And now black has to be once again precise, because white has regained the pawn and threatens both the d6 and the c6 pawn. But here we have strong sequence. We go knight e5, hitting the rook, inducing rook takes d6, and now before taking here, we first hit the knight, induce knight takes c6, rook d7 also possible, then we take on c4, and after rook c6, now the point is that there is a fork here, so white has to drop the rook back, and after rook d3, after rook d7 also, we take on e3 and play bishop f6. It's also comfortable with king g7 next. And after rook takes rook d3, sorry, we take on e3, rook e3, and now bishop d4 followed by c5 leads to a very simplified equal endgame. But the most normal is the move 21 knight takes c6. That's also what happened in the game Jumabayev-Zhigalko, Aeroflot 2017. Here black takes on c4, and after rook d3 takes on e4, and the position is very simplified and equal. And I continued a little bit because in the game actually Zhigalko managed to get outplayed, but at this point black is just completely fine after, for example, after bishop a7, which was played in the game. A very strong move is rook c8. I mean, everything is fine, but rook c8 is the most accurate if you want, and after rook d7, a strong idea is bishop f8. Rook d7 very clever. If rook c6 there is rook b8, there is a back rank issue. You have to go bishop f8, which loses of course to rook f8 and rook f7. But we here start with bishop f8, very strong, threaten the knight, and after rook takes f7, we have a strong move king g8, hitting both the rook and the knight, and black is winning there because rook f6 is met by bishop g7. So it's white cannot take on f7, he has to draw back with his pieces, and black is very fine. Very, very, very concrete solution. But that is once again because I don't want to recommend officially a position which is potentially slightly worse for black, but it's really not a big deal if you play, I mean, if I play an opponent that I think I'm a better player than, then I can easily go for this and just hope that he will eventually give me an opportunity to strike with b5 or potentially f5, so nothing wrong with that. Also not a very bad version of the Maroczy bind. We have the light squared bishop, so nothing to panic about, but this does equalize very, very brutally and very forcefully, so I like that as well. And also it is also possible, as I mentioned, to go for knight f6 and try to avoid this line somehow with very clever move orders. And also knight c bishop b5, there are options of I believe a6, bishop c6 bc was also a thing, so many different ways of playing. Of course, there's the thing with the sidelines. Usually if white plays something not very critical, black also has plenty of options that are fine. Now it's time to move on to knight takes d4 and f6 f3 line. Interesting idea. White wants to protect e4 pawn with the f pawn, not yet with the knight, keeping the option of c4 open. So if black, for example, makes some move, like, I don't know, well, let's say a6, hoping to get the knight, that would of course be not very clever, because white would then go c4 and get a very decent version of the Maroczy bind. He would have to play some sort of hedgehog, which is something we don't want. So here I recommend the move e5, the most straightforward move. White should go knight b3, bishop b5 check is also played a lot, but it's a very bad system. Knight b7. If white plays knight b3 here, we can develop bishop e7 or a6 first. A very weird combination of moves. Just knight f5 is how they usually follow up, but that's really, really not very good. We hit him with d5, e5, sacrifice this pawn. In fact, we're not in a rush to regain it. As you will see, this pawn on d5, it blocks the d5 square, now it's no longer a problem, and it's just a long-term weakness the white has, and we don't really need to regain it. We can play here a6. After bishop a4 we go b5, bishop b3, knight c5, and after knight e3 we don't even need to once again, we can of course try to regain it. We'll surely manage easily bishop b7, but that's not the point. We don't need it. We just play the position. White is completely underdeveloped. Just go bishop d6, castle, castle. Next we either go knight h5, f5, or simply e4, knight c3, e4 simply. And white's pieces are just terrible, and the d5 pawn is only in the way of all of his pieces. The knight doesn't have a square, the bishop is diagonal is closed, so just fantastic composition for black, just very beautiful. If you haven't seen the game between, for example, Karpov and Kasparov, where he has this octopus knight on d3, and there you have the similar motif of this pawn on d5, which is in the way of white's pieces. If you haven't seen that game, definitely check it out. It's if you just Google Karpov Kasparov octopus knight, you'll get there, but it comes from e4 c5, knight f3, e6, d4 c knight d4, knight c6, knight b5, d6 c4, knight f6, knight c3, a6, knight a3, d5 from this line. And here too white has the d5 pawn, and Karpov brought the bishop to b3 and eventually got outplayed. So these kind of pawn sacrifices, they are known to be good for black. And after 9, bishop takes d7, bishop takes d7, again after knight d3 black is doing fantastic. We can play bishop c5, certainly can play bishop c5 and castle, but even more brutal is knight h5 directly. If now white goes g3, we also go bishop c5 of course, and if castle, which is natural, then we go f5. Again, we can start with bishop c5 and castle, but f5 is just very brutal. We threaten f4, bishop c5 check, and simply knight g3, queen h4 mate, just trying to win the game pretty much outright. And white is actually in great deal of trouble here already. He can try to block the bishop with d6. After bishop e6, we're just going to pick up the d6 pawn. We have bishop pair, fantastic pawns. This knight on e3 is very strange. Black is just much better here. A lot of games actually in the database, but very bad system. Bishop e5 check. Knight b3 is the way to go. Here I recommend the move d5, which leads to a very comfortable endgame, a double-edged endgame as well. I managed to win a game against Hare Krishna in one of the Shenzhen tournaments that I played. I believe a perfect line for black, but there are also options here that could lead to more complex double-edged positions that you can certainly explore. I particularly have one favorite, and that is something I found out just really a few days ago. I never knew that that particular trap, but I was watching, was following some tournament, watching some live commentary on YouTube on the side, and one of the games went this way, and somebody played a5, and then the commentator, who was a grandmaster I didn't know much about, he suddenly showed the point of this move, and something I never knew before, that if white plays a logical c4, which is often his plan, to play knight c3, suddenly white is losing here because of knight takes e4, f takes e4, queen h4 check, and now the point is, obviously g3, queen e4 is losing the rook. That's always been the case, but of course white always had the move king d2. But here with the pawn on a5, suddenly after a4 the knight on b3 has nowhere to go. So this is a trick I have absolutely never seen before, to my shame. Very beautiful trick. But in terms of objective play, yeah, here white has options. He can play a4, also bishop b5 check, also knight c3. It's a question if black equalizes this way, in fact, but definitely possible. If you want to surprise your opponent, it's possible to explore this further. And in terms of how to explore, because sometimes I say always explore further, but I don't really know if everybody knows what exactly I mean. So there are different, of course, players. Those who are already either professional or aspiring professionals, they know what means explore. But if you are new to this, then in general, how I would approach it is you look up the games into the databases. Now there are a lot of databases. There are, of course, the paid products. There are also the online databases that are free. So you check out various games that were played particularly by high-rated players, and then you next to that, if you're lucky, you can find some of these games annotated, so that would also be helpful. And also, of course, you should, and I think that's very important these days, you You should also use the help of chess engine, and there are again different tools you can do so with different softwares or different websites. Probably as a Chessable user, as a Chessable author, I should recommend Chessable. I mean, Chessable also has a function of the engine, so you can just see what the computer suggests and see how that relates to the games that you see. And yeah, that is basically how you can investigate some of these options on your own. Basically, I think good combination is to look at the games and very necessarily use strong computers to see what they think about these positions, because these computers these days are so good. They are no longer telling nonsense. They're usually coming up with very decent ideas. But that is for the move a5. My main recommendation is d5. A very good move, trying to solve the problems immediately, breaking in the center before white gets to set up any sort of a bind. Here the line continues with bishop g5. e5 is the wrong move order. We can take even with the knight and we are fine. Bishop g5 is how white plays. Now I recommend bishop e6. There was also a trend with d4 actually at some point. It leads to a fine position. I remember I checked it a long time ago, but it's a lot more complex. Bishop e6 is simpler. Now again, some players play e5, but that would be not accurate, because we can take with queen on d5, and white cannot now take on f6 because we take on d1 intermezzo and his king is misplaced. If white now plays knight c3, then we can take on d1, rook d1, play knight bd7, and have a good position. Just a comfortable endgame, nothing to worry about. White usually starts with bishop f6, gf, and now e5. There's no point to start with the check. We play knight c6, so e5 is a better move order. Queen d5. Now white takes on d5, bishop d5, and knight c3. And here, yeah, we have to preserve our bishop pair, and we get this very interesting endgame. We have bishop pair, which is huge in endgame. It's very important to have a bishop pair. We have dark square bishop. We have these doubled pawns, but not sure at all that's a big issue. After f5, these two pawns are looking pretty good. Potential for passed pawn on the e file. The only slight issue that black actually has is that he's slightly behind in development, but that is going to be solved by developing pieces, so all's going to be fine. Knight b5 is a one-trick pony. As I say here, I was very proud of this joke. I hope you find it equally funny. One-trick pony. Knight pony. Knight a6, protecting from the fork. Long castle, and now I like the move king e7, getting out of any knight d6 check, and the king is really perfect on e7, especially when there is no knight d5 check. And next we want to play ideally h5, bishop h6. We want to push the pawn first and then place the bishop behind, but also bishop h5, bishop h6 immediately will work. So knight b5 reaches nowhere. Long castle is more critical. Now we play knight c6. Knight d7 is also a move, but knight c6 is good. It's what I played against Hare Krishna. Bishop b5. White doesn't have many challenging alternatives. Knight e4, again met by king e7, walking out of this check. King on e7 is of course very good, connecting the two rooks, and again if there's no knight d5 check, of course. Bishop b5. Here I recommend rook c8. Down the main line here, white can give a move repetition. So if you fear that your opponent is well prepared, and for example you're playing the last round and he needs just a draw and you need to win, and he plays everything quickly, then you can deviate here. Also, there are many ways to play this position. You can play a6 and play this endgame. There is no move repetition, that's for sure. You can also start with rook g8 first, hit the g2 pawn, and then next play a6. And yeah, the thing is, computer will give a small plus for white, but it's based on very strong play, and it's not even clear if it's real. So definitely options. But I will show you the way I played against Hare Krishna, the most harmonious way, and I also managed to win the game. But there is a move repetition that we allow. That's rook c8, knight d5, the best move. Important to mention, knight a5. That's a very nice trap, by the way, a very nice one. Please note. Here we play king e7. We get out of the spin. No, this spin. And after knight takes b7, we have now strong move knight d4. We're hitting the bishop. Knight is suddenly horrible, and here black has out of nowhere a very strong initiative. So knight a5 falls for the trick. Knight d5 is a better move. And here is the last moment to deviate. I recommend f5, which is the most harmonious move. And white can now give a check on f6, king e7, check on d5. Now we shouldn't take, because if we take rook d5, king e6, white can play rook hd1. And white has a very strong light squared bishop, and if we go knight d4, we win the exchange. But after knight d4, king d5, knight f5, white has a tremendous light square control. He drops the bishop back, and yeah, he has beautiful compensation for the exchange. So we should allow a move repetition with f5. So here is the last moment to jump out of this move repetition, and it's not so difficult to do so. You can play bishop, okay, e7, of course, but also bishop g7. Bishop g7 looks even more ambitious, but yeah, it's also not a big deal actually. It's playable, but f5 is just more harmonious, and yeah, if bishop g7, you should only play if of course you fear the move repetition, but normally it's on white. The pressure is on white to play for advantage in the opening, and in fact not everybody realizes that bishop d5 is not a thing. I think Hare Krishna didn't even give a check to me. After the game I asked him why you didn't include the checks, and then he said that he wasn't sure about bishop d5, I think. So yeah, knight f5 is what I recommend. f6, king e7, one check, king e8. White can take away the right of black to castle short, but we'll never wanted to castle short. We'll never manage that. And here white has a few options if he wants to play for advantage. Hare Krishna played knight a5 against me, and yeah, once again there's a trick here. Now I go bishop a6 check, king b1, and here a very strong move, king f8. We walk out once again of the spin, and after knight b7 there is knight d4, and yeah, Hare Krishna realized it, and he had to return to b3. And of course now, yeah, he just lost a huge tempo, a 2 tempo in fact. I brought the king to g7, and I converted this game very nicely. Long term, black has of course this bishop pair and this strong pawns, and managed to win the game. So knight a5 is a small inaccuracy already. Actually, serious inaccuracy actually. Challenging is the move bishop a4, a very sophisticated move, stepping out of this a6 move. Now if a6, white has knight b6, the b6 square. But here we give a check again, king b1, king f8, moving out of the pin, intending king g7. And after knight c5, which was played in Smith Kamer in Vacanze 2020, Kamer played knight d4, knight e6, f6, knight f6, king to e7. Smith went knight d7, Kamer played rook hd8, gave whites a pawn, knight e5, bishop g7. But after knight d3, he will follow it up with b5 and a5, and have a tremendous compensation for the pawn, and Kamer even won the game. Although at this point position is around even, but I like an even more ambitious pawn sacrifice, not knight d4 here, but knight king g7. Give him the b7 pawn, and after knight b7 again knight d4, and once again white's pieces are quite misplaced. Knight on b7 in particular is pretty sad. Up knight c3, I like the suggestion of the engine rook hg8, preparing king to f6 or king to h8, opening the g file for the rook. And after knight d5, for example, white tries to somehow trade the strong knight on d4. We play king f6, and after knight d4 ed, white has some serious problems. The g2 pawn is hanging. If of course rook g1 is met by bishop e3, g3 is met by bishop d5, and so black is already very comfortable here. A very strong sequence here. Yeah, bishop a6, king f8, king g7, knight d4, logical and strong. Yeah, bishop a4 is very sophisticated. The more natural is rook h1. Now we kick the bishop with a6. That's the point. Now bishop a4, of course, will get trapped after b5. So here white takes, but now we take on c6, and we are fortunate that white has no time to take the e5 pawn. If he plays knight b6, we go rook b8. If knight f6, of course, king e7 check. King e7, of course, would be the response to the check. Knight b8, knight b6 we play rook b8, and after knight a4 we have the time to protect our e5 pawn with f6. And we've got these two strong bishops, and the position is is only balanced because white, well, because the engine plays very strong with white. In terms of human play, I believe black is already for choice with very strong bishops and this a strong pawn center. I don't know if it's called the center if it's on f5 and f6, but it is still I believe it feels as though it's the center, so I'll call it a pawn center. That is for the f3 variation. I should say f3. It's been played by some specialists back in the day. Only few decent players played it. But it's become something a little more popular when Magnus used it against Fabian Caruana against Sergei Karyakin. He used it in his must not lose game in the rapid tiebreak, and everybody realized that this was what Magnus prepared against Najdorf for the match. So people started taking it seriously, and that's one of the reasons why Hare Krishna played it. But already by the time Hare Krishna played me, I was aware of this line, and we've checked it quite thoroughly, and this e5 d5 thing seems to be comfortable. So a system that's become a little more mainstream now, and it has its followers. There are some books, I believe, that recommend this f3 system, and they have some kind of titles like, Crash Sicilian, this, that, and so those of your opponents who bought these books, they might play it, so it's good to be aware of it. But I believe you are more than well equipped after seeing this chapter. So all in all, thank you for watching, and see you in the next chapter.